Okay. Welcome to Acura. I'm James Carden. Today is the very first in what we plan to be a series of conversations over the coming months with distinguished, thoughtful, and that last adjective is really the key, members of the community of experts on Russia, Ukraine, and the post-Soviet space. Today, we are very pleased to be joined by Professor Richard Sakwa. Richard is Emeritus Professor of Russian and European Politics and head of the School of Politics and International Relations at the University of Kent in the UK. He is author of numerous books, including The Putin Paradox, Deception, Russiagate and the New Cold War, Russia's Futures, Frontline Ukraine, among many others. His latest, from Yale University Press, is The Lost Peace, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War, which our fellow Acura board member, Marlene Laruelle, has praised as a long-awaited, nuanced analysis of the multi-layered crisis in which the world finds itself. Today, Richard's principal interlocutor will be our very own David Speedy. David was a founding member of the Acura board and for many years served as senior fellow and director of the program on U.S. global engagement at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. Prior to this, he chaired the program on international peace and security at the Carnegie Corporation. So Richard, thank you very much for joining us. And David, I'm going to hand things over to you.
Thank you, James, and it's a great pleasure and privilege to be speaking this morning with Richard Sakwa. Marlene's testament to the book was both appropriate, and I would add that it's path-breaking. And I was particularly striking, Richard, as the subtitle of the book, How the West Failed to Prevent a Second Cold War. First of all, the term Cold War, of course, our mentor and co-founder of Acura, the late, great Steve Cohen, was one of the first to sort of acknowledge in print that we were indeed in a second Cold War. And of course, since the Ukraine episode beginning 2 years ago in 2022, it's been getting even warmer. But what's also striking is how the West failed. Now, there's no mass whitewashing of Russia in this volume, but is it fair to say, as we jump into the deep end here, is it fair to say that Russia's actions, at least up to the Ukraine invasion, and even there's some ample room for discussion as to what led to this, is it fair to say that at least up till then, Russia's actions have been really, in fact, reactions to Western policies and actions toward Russia since the end of the First Cold War?
Yes, thank you very much. Great pleasure to be with you. Just to say that I'm no longer head of department, so that should be for the historical record. But as for the substance, thank you for your kind words about the book. It really was an attempt to open up the discussion of the sort of issues you've just raised. A vision of that lost peace, which has, after the end of the Cold War, was indeed squandered. There are two things. As for the notion of a Cold War, I was also initially skeptical about it because of the attempt or the way of trying to shoehorn what's going on today into an old model or an old pattern of politics. However, I've now, perhaps the zeal of the convert, now fully bought into the idea, well, not bought, defend now very strongly, that a Cold War is a specific pattern of politics. I mean, Stephen Cohen made this point very eloquently and I think convincingly. It's a type of politics. It's the way that states relate with each other, which is distinctive in the nuclear age in particular, but perhaps of greater relevance as well, where you have this sort of endemic hostility, deeply entrenched, the demonization of the enemy, Stephen made that point, the inability to conduct international politics in a normal conduit of diplomacy, let alone genuine dialogue and empathy. So that's the first point. As for the subtitle, I'm so glad you've brought up the point, because we, with the publishers, had considerable discussion about this. One of the alternative versions, and the one we went with for quite a long time, was The Lost Peace, how we lost, or how we failed to prevent a second Cold War. But the we was considered rather wishy-washy. On the other hand, we would say, yes, it's collective responsibility, to come to your point. But ultimately, I think the idea of the West having been the main actor in all of this is accurate. And so the way I see it is that since 1945, and as part of the first Cold War, we saw the creation of this political West, a political West which, the Russians like to talk and the Chinese like to talk a bit less, but they do, of a collective West. But a political West is a very specific phenomenon after 1945. I mean, obviously antecedents earlier, with two elements to it. The first element is this vision, which I now conceptualize it in terms of a commonwealth. This is what Eikenberry talks about as a liberal international order, liberal internationalism, all those good things, open trade, navigation, obviously with its own pathologies today in a neoliberal variant, financialization, inequality, precarity, and all those other things. But nevertheless, a commonwealth, a vision of the political West as a benign, force. The other side, let's put it simply, empire. That's the coercion, 800 US military bases across the world. And this political West, Russia would have been happy to join the Commonwealth side of these things. China would have been, we all would have been, but the empire side of this political West would have meant assuming a subaltern status. We know that UK and France, of course, did after 1956, and before that, Germany and Japan after 1945. So ultimately, yes, the West bears a huge responsibility. Putin, of course, in his early years was, genuinely trying to engage with that political West. And of course, no opening was found, no formula was found.
The cornerstone of what might have prevented Cold War II is something you see as the Charter International System. It's fascinatingly developed in the book. It's basically, I think, a set of international norms, respect for genuinely international institutions and those norms, as opposed to what has emerged and metastasized in the US-led West, an odd sort of bundle of definitions of liberalism, liberal internationalism, and what you describe at one point as an evangelical application or version of liberalism, and also a kind of one-size-fits-all as seen from Washington. If you could develop that a little bit, and also please describe a little bit your fascinating concept of the great substitution.
Oh, yeah. Thank you. That really is the core of the book, that after 1945, there was the establishment of the UN-based, United Nations-based Charter International System. And of course, I didn't go into it in enormous depth, but the whole debate leading to the establishment of the United Nations basically was a compromise. The United Nations, or the Charter system, does not belong to the political West country. Of course, they played a big part. US played a big part in it. UK did as well. But China was a founder member. India had its voice in the Arabic world as well. So the Charter International System belongs to humanity. A second point about it is that this UN-based system expressed not just to compromises during the Second World War of the Allies against Nazi Germany and Japan, Imperial Japan, but also it envisaged a type of politics which I suggest is we can call sovereign internationalism. This is an internationalism which was going to be based on multilateral organization, UN, plus its 20-odd agencies, all the body of international law which has developed on its basis, including, of course, the Genocide Convention, which is very much in the news today, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of that. So this international charter system and the model of politics associated with it is that this charter, this sovereign internationalism, is the overarching framework which politics exists to this day. It establishes what is what the normative framework, that is the legal and moral framework against which states are judged. Obviously, too often in a breach, but there you go. On the other side, within this international system, we have political orders. And I mean, absolutely essential to distinguish between system and the suborders. The Soviet Union was one earlier and its allies, and it collapsed. After 1989, after the end of the Cold War, the United States' own political order, the political West, as you say, metastasized. It claimed to be universal. It claimed to be also, the unique, the only one, and that alternatives weren't allowed to develop. And of course, today we see this with the intensifying conflict with China and the language in which that conflict is couched. So, but unfortunately, after 1989, there were elements of it earlier, of this substitution, that the part considers itself the whole. And of course, Russia, China simply could not accept it. And of course, a large number of states in the global south can no longer accept it. And this is a new actor. The state system, the post-colonial, decolonized world of that world has the state system has matured, and states now demand, not just ask, demand to be heard. And hence, it's not accidental that it was South Africa which launched the case at the International Court of Justice over developments in Palestine, Gaza today. It's a system has matured. Indonesia, Mexico, all India, of course, they demand their voice. And so the old pattern, this is very new in the second Cold War compared to the first. So this substitution is, in a sense, where the battle lines are drawn and why the global South is losing respect for the political West, the US-led West, because it itself is flouting the rules which it was so instrumental in establishing earlier on.
James, again, feel free to.
Sure. So,
you
you mentioned the global South and its reaction to what's going on in Gaza right now. Of course, their reaction to Russia's invasion of Ukraine a couple of years back also differs rather mightily from what the reaction has been or was expected, I suppose, in Washington and London and Berlin. So, I'm wondering if you could perhaps touch upon that. That seemed to me to be sort of the first serious sign of independence and muscle shown on the part of the global South, and sort of rejecting the Western narrative with regard to the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, no, thanks for that. We are indeed, as Xi Jinping put it, visiting Moscow earlier last year. We're living in epochal times, and we're living in a moment of fundamental, well, change, development, and it's why it's so useful to have discussions like this to try to get a handle on what is going on. At the moment, 54 states have sent arms to support Ukraine in this war. 54, overwhelmingly the Western Europe or European and North American states, as well as Japan and South Korea, the two main ones outside of the Atlantic basin. But the rest, yes, of course, the actual events of February 2022 were, certainly not. It was certainly provoked, but maybe that the response is clearly, highly controversial in legal terms. Yet the global south, and this is something fundamentally new in the last 500 years of global history, is that finally they're saying, look, you in the global north having these endless conflicts. You had the First World War, you got us involved. You had the Second World War, you got us involved. This time, we ain't playing that game anymore. We want a different politics. Let's go back. Let's genuinely stand on those principles which you have declared in 1945 of sovereign internationalism. And of course, the political West is couching the war in Ukraine as a war of civilization, which makes it even more exposed to the charges of double standards. Now, double standards in this system, in the political West, isn't just an incidental. It's actually how the system functions. It's, if you like, that imperial element. Empires always have double standards, where you have the mailed fist always, couched in the fine words of the velvet glove. And the global South isn't playing the game anymore. And this is an epochal shift. And this is why a lot of people in Moscow and in China and in New Delhi, by the way, the present Indian Foreign Minister, Jaishankar, who in his excellent book, The India Way, makes it quite explicit that we're in a new world. I mean, the Russians like to call it multipolarity, but it doesn't matter really what you term it, but it's certainly with a world in which the global West, the political West, can no longer dominate in the way it used to.
Richard, on the political West, there are nuances in here, of course, and the relationship between the U.S. and its own allies is often way back in Moscow in January '94 at the Moscow summit. The then number 2 at the State Department, Strobe Talbot, spoke quite clearly about the U.S. will dictate the terms of the New World Order. An interesting time and place. And Brzezinski before him had spoken of the U.S. and its allies as the hegemon and its vassals. To what extent, obviously the U.S. is, I like to paraphrase and say, he who calls the tune pays the piper. And that's why we are paying our disproportionate amount to NATO, for example, to the chagrin of Washington politicians, quite obviously. But how do you think the Ukraine, especially now that support for Ukraine is softening, the supply of arms is problematical? I mean, various articles recently about how the U.S., how the Pentagon is slowing down. We've got the Middle East, as James has said. We've got Taiwan on the horizon, possibly. How is this relationship evolving in your vantage point from the UK, of course, which is probably America's most loyal vassal, as it were? But how do you see this now and in the future?
Yeah, there's plenty more conflicts adding to your list. We've got Yemen, we've got a civil war effectively in Sudan, and so many more in the Sahel, and on it goes. It's really a time in which, well, what this means is that Ukraine is decentered. It was initially posed as a war of civilizations, that the fate of European security, which of course has been non-existent for many years, was going to be settled. We now see, and I agree, I quote, that ultimately it's a war you could say equivalent to the wars of Yugoslav succession of the 1990s, a dreadful event, but ultimately a sideshow to the real major shifts in global politics today. I mean, that doesn't for a second undermine the tragic character of what's going on and the stakes. But as for this vassal question, it's something which I mean, I think it's a crucial issue. This war and has intensified, this endless discussion about bloc unity, bloc politics, this idea of we mustn't allow Russia, now China, to have wedges between the allies, the NATO allies, the Western powers, the G7 today, And of course, that sort of obsession with bloc unity is precisely Cold War thinking, which just perpetuates their endless conflict. As for vassals, I like to joke that I am the last Gaullist standing in the UK. And of course, Gaullism in the UK was never a popular idea. But by this, and of course, there's a lot of neo-Gaullist thinking in France, but it's still a Macron at one point considered himself the de Gaulle of our day, but he turned out to be very much not a de Gaulle. But the idea of some sort of the way that this bloc unity and to use the word vassalage as Brzezinski used. I mean, shocking when you read how he described the allies in the Great Grand Chessboard in 1997. And he said, of course, the United States must never allow these countries, to maintain. They need to maintain the vassal status. I mean, he didn't make any bones about it, so you had to give it to him. He didn't mince his words. But this neo-Gaullism is an attempt to say, look, Europe needs to take control of its own destiny. There is a lot of this sort of talk in a very inverted form, perverted form, in my view, in discussing the dangers of a second Trump presidency, where discussion that the United States may leave NATO, and hence Congress is passing a law saying he can't do it, and all of that. But what we need is a genuine attempt to achieve pan-continental unity. Macron used to say it. We cannot have European security with Russia outside it. And one way or another, that continues to this day. We need to find a system, and that's the only way the Ukraine war will end, is when Russia is part of a larger, global reconciliation. I don't mean peace, but some sort of dialogue between Washington and Moscow, and above all, on a pan-continental view. That Europe, in my view, needs to take control of its own destiny and not be driven by agendas from outside of the continent. Obviously, we want to be friends with all outside the continent, but that doesn't mean this subaltern status.
I'm really pleased that you mentioned de Gaulle. I happen to have right next to me Julian Jackson's
Oh, great.
book.
So my shelves behind me. Yeah.
And
Mine too, I think.
Yeah.
I'm an enormous admirer of the general, and we mentioned earlier at the beginning of this, there was a certain vision of the political West after 1945, and de Gaulle's vision was inclusive, right? He said in a famous speech in 1956, I think,
59, I think, in Strasbourg.
Of the Atlantic to the Europe,
Yes.
right? And that was a vision also shared by Gorbachev. To an extent, it was also a vision shared by George H.W. Bush. And it seems to me that vision was abandoned, totally rejected in the 1990s, where kind of everything seemed to go haywire that was the start of the kind of disastrous, relations that we have between Russia and the West now. You've touched upon that in your writings, particularly the view of globalization. How did the 1990s view of globalization, help bring about where we are today?
Yeah. Indeed, in the 1990s, and the more that we look at it, the more we realize that baleful political settlement imposed by Clinton and Strobe Talbot, whom you've mentioned, and you read Strobe Talbot's book, and basically they're treating Russia as a defeated power, and of course Moscow will never accept that it was a defeated power, and that's one of the themes of the book, that the end of the Cold War was a joint and common endeavor. However, I'd slightly modify what you're saying in arguing that George H.W. Bush, yes, he did, pursue reconciliation, strategic partnership, and genuinely, after some hesitation, with Brent Scowcroft, by the way, really did engage with Gorbachev and then Yeltsin. But the problem with that is that, given what we talked before about the political West, that the Commonwealth side of George H.W. Bush was very powerful, and he accepted that formula of a European peace. That is, that the security has to be indivisible, basically from Lisbon to Vladivostok. But the other side of the George H.W. Bush settlement was that empire view. And it was quite explicit in his speech in Mainz, already just a few months before Gorbachev's Common European Home speech, in which he talked about Europe whole and free. Now, that's a fine sentiment. We all will love to have that. But it was very explicitly a repudiation of Gorbachev's pan-continental European vision, a repudiation of that Gaullist formula, which was common European home. That is one of those great paradoxes, is that the political West has these two faces, the Commonwealth face and the empire face. And it's like a Rubens vase, where you either have what you call a vase. It's either a vase or vase, or two faces. And in that thing, you can't see both at the same time. It's either one or the other, and that's part of human psychology. But I think that, the task of the intellectual is to be able to hold two relatively incompatible ideas in their head at the same time and still function in one way or another.
Richard, another felicitous phrase you use in the book, the way one war ends shapes the next. And that certainly seems to me to be the case here. Of course, it began, I mean, the triumphalism of the West, which people such as Jack Matlock, who was very much involved at the time, have rejected. But the triumphalism led to the West's role in the disastrous decade of Yeltsin. And then we're all very aware of the various sort of things that Russia has seen as slights, NATO expansion, the Kosovo situation, which you've described as the critical turning point in U.S.-Russia and Western-Russia relations. But the key factor in the attitude toward Russia, it seems to me, is just simply the generic disregard of Russia's interests and the willingness, again, to this definition of the statesman, to see the point of view of the fellow on the other side of the table, to me is what has characterized this second Cold War situation. And I'd be interested, yesterday, John Mearsheimer was interviewed by Anatol Lieven for Quincy, and he was talking about his new book is on rationalism. And he said that NATO expansion was unwise, but not irrational, because it was grounded in certain beliefs of the West, led by the US, of the spread of democracy and so on and so forth. But I think I was interested in comparing this with your point in the book, that in fact it was irrational, because NATO expansion, which was designed to protect against potential Russia expansionism or future violent activity, has actually resulted in the very fear that it was designed to prevent. So that's a rather convoluted question, for which I apologize, but I think you get the gist of it.
I do, yes, and thank you very much for that. It was the NATO, as John Mearsheimer is absolutely right. In and of itself, NATO enlargement made a lot of sense. It made a lot of sense because it stops the smaller powers, a repetition of the 1930s situation where you have, Hungary, Czechoslovakia versus Poland, and today, hopefully prevents a war between Greece and Turkey and so on. So that makes sort of sense. And of course, to have these states, overlain on Russia's borders also makes sense. However, NATO enlargement, the way it took place, and if you recall, even Brzezinski we talked about earlier in his 1997 book, The Grand Chessboard, said, a great passionate advocate of NATO enlargement, but he said it has to be embedded in a larger framework of security with Moscow. This is a point which, as you say, I'd like certainly to praise in, laud the great work of Jack Matlock, but also another great book by William Hill, No Place for Russia, and so many other excellent US scholars who've, argued, and Stephen Cohen, of course, amongst that group, of people who, saying it's the way it was done, and that you needed to have this. And William Burns, by the way, head of CIA today, also made this point. So it was, NATO enlargement. And the problem was, and this is where I disagree with John, is that ultimately NATO and that framework in which it is embedded is a system of collective defense. Whereas what we needed after 1991 was a system of collective security. And we in Europe never had it. So when there's this endless talk today about European security orders now being destroyed by Russia's actions in Ukraine, well, I say there never was this European post-war and post-Cold War European security order. Because if Moscow's outside of it, how can you talk? The big power, the nuclear power, the one who's vast and looming on the eastern border, clearly disgruntled. What sort of European security order can we talk about? So we needed that overarching element. And I think, that thinkers in the West vaguely understood this. The Permanent Joint Council of 1997, of course, was a sop, and that really was cynical, classic Clintonian cynicism, and, trying to feed, as Tolbert put it, the spinach to Moscow, which, take their medicine, may hurt you, but, it hurts us more. And of course, the understanding that's why they had the NATO-Russia Council of 2002. But every time we needed that NATO-Russia Council, it was not convened, as in 2008 and 2014. So again, this was a palliative and not substantive. And of course, that takes us to the fundamental point after 1991 or end of the Cold War, that the lack of institutional innovation and the lack of ideological or ideational or even intellectual innovation. We've stagnated for this 30 years and allowed resentments of which you started to list, Kosovo, ballistic missile defense in Poland and Romania today, and the whole list, Libya, the list goes on. And of course, the US unilateral abrogation of the ABM treaty in June 2002. It goes on and on. So there was no collective security. And that takes us to where we can start today. How do we go beyond where we are today? And so therefore, we do need to start thinking of a new collective security order within the framework of the Charter International System, because there's nothing beyond it. In 1945, we saw how the League of Nations failed, and there were loads of ideas of how to deal with it. Not consensus initially, but there were ideas. There's nothing today, no ideas of how to manage global affairs outside of the United Nations-based Charter International System. That's why when countries like Zelensky did in that initial discussion in the United Nations General Assembly meeting just after the invasion in March 2022, said that Russia should be expelled from the Security Council, and that would destroy the whole system. And so this is those people who say, obviously, United Nations needs reform, but those who say we should start again, I absolutely categorically disagree with that.
Right.
I know we have to wrap up. Our host is giving us the eye. I will just do so in 30 seconds, Richard, by saying, when I took over at Carnegie Corporation, the program was called Cooperative Security. And it was changed later by our president against my wishes, but he was the president. Finally, I want to say that when you talk about Brazil, Japan, Mexico, etc., you say in the book, they are finding their voice and the language they speak is sovereign internationalism. So let's hear it for the Global South. And thank you.
Thanks very much.